500 people watched Vivienne Ashcroft die at the altar, and not one of them moved to stop it. Her wedding was supposed to be the most beautiful night of her life. Instead, Grant Holloway stood beneath the chandeliers of Blackthorn Hall and confessed, in front of every camera, every witness, every person who'd ever envied her, that he was in love with someone else, that Vivienne was too weak, too emotional, too small for the life he intended to build. She walked out into the rain with nothing. Then a black SUV stopped at the curb, and the most dangerous man in New York offered her an umbrella. If you've ever been humiliated by someone you trusted completely, stay until the end, like this video. Drop your city in the comments. I want to see how far this story travels. This is part 1. Shots. The rain came down hard enough to blur the streetlights into smears of orange and white, and Vivienne Ashcroft stood on the steps of Blackthorn Hall in a $30,000 wedding gown that was soaking through at the hem, and she did not cry. She would not cry. She had made that decision somewhere between the moment Grant's voice cracked on the word Celeste and the moment she understood he had rehearsed this. The slight tremor in his jaw, the way he kept his eyes slightly above her head, not meeting her gaze but performing for the guests behind her. He had rehearsed the confession. He had chosen the venue deliberately. 500 witnesses. Every major New York outlet represented somewhere in that crowd. He had not simply fallen out of love with her. He had arranged her public dismantling with the same strategic precision he applied to campaign press releases. That was the thing that kept her upright, the sheer crystalline clarity of that realization. Inside, the murmuring had started immediately. She could still hear it faintly through the cathedral's massive doors, a low oceanic hum of scandal and sympathy, and something uglier than both. The particular thrill that moves through a crowd when someone falls from a great height and lands where everyone can see. She had removed her veil in the doorway. She had not thrown it, had not dropped it dramatically. She had simply folded it over one arm, descended the exterior steps without looking back, and walked directly into the rain. Now her shoes were ruined. She looked down at them. Ivory silk, handmade, $4,000, a gift from her mother who was probably still inside trying to manage the narrative with a champagne flute in her hand. The dye was bleeding in dark rivulets across the stone steps. She watched it happen with the same detached curiosity she might give to a science experiment. Something beautiful, becoming something unrecognizable. She was familiar with the process. The Manhattan street beyond the cathedral courtyard was nearly empty. A Saturday night in late October, cold enough that anyone sensible was inside somewhere. Occasional headlights swept past. A cab slowed and then accelerated when the driver noticed her dress. She did not blame him. She probably looked insane. She was thinking about the list. That was the thing nobody warned you about. That in the immediate aftermath of catastrophic humiliation, your brain did not shut down. It accelerated. It started cataloging. She was standing in the rain, mentally listing every interaction from the past year that she had misread, every dinner conversation she had attributed to campaign stress, every night he had come to bed already facing away, every time Celeste Monroe's name had appeared in her phone screen as she passed it on the counter, and she had told herself it was professional and nothing more. The list was long. The rain was getting worse. She heard the vehicles before she saw them. 4 black armored SUVs moving in tight convoy formation, emerging from 52nd Street with the kind of unhurried deliberateness that communicated power without announcing it. No sirens, no visible police escort, just 4 massive vehicles that seemed to part the light rain around them, pulling to the curb directly in front of the cathedral steps with a precision that suggested the driver knew exactly where she was standing before he turned the corner. Vivienne did not move. The rear door of the second vehicle opened. He stepped out onto the wet pavement, and the first thing she noticed was that he did not seem to feel the rain. It fell on his black suit jacket, and he ignored it completely, the way certain men ignore things that would stop other men. As though the weather had registered his indifference and decided not to bother. Tall, broader across the shoulders than his tailoring entirely concealed, dark hair that the rain was beginning to darken further at the temples. A face that was... She searched for the right word and kept arriving at the wrong ones. Handsome was inadequate. Severe was closer, but missed something essential. There was an absolute stillness to his expression that she associated with people who had learned very early that displaying emotion was a tactical liability. His eyes found her immediately. They were a pale gray-green that the streetlights rendered almost colorless, the kind of eyes that would be unsettling in a well-lit room and were considerably more unsettling in the rain outside a cathedral at 10 o'clock on a Saturday night. He reached back into the vehicle without looking away from her and withdrew a black umbrella, which he opened with a single practiced motion. Then he walked toward her. He stopped 2 steps below her on the cathedral stairs, close enough that the umbrella covered them both, far enough that she didn't feel cornered. He said, "You're going to get hypothermia standing here." She said, "I'm aware of that." He looked at her for a moment. Not the look she had been receiving all evening, not the pitying glance or the avid, voyeuristic stare of someone cataloging damage for later retelling. Something more considered than that. Something that felt disconcertingly like being assessed rather than observed. "Come with me, Vivienne," he said. 5 words. Quiet. Not a command. She would have reacted badly to a command, but not quite a request either. Something in between. An offer with weight behind it. She knew who he was. Everyone in New York knew who Dorian Vale was, or believed they did. The newspapers knew him as a billionaire real estate developer whose portfolio had transformed 3 Manhattan neighborhoods and whose philanthropic ventures were sufficiently well documented to generate positive press coverage without inviting scrutiny. The financial pages knew him as the controlling interest behind Vale Capital, a private equity firm whose acquisition record was impressive enough to be intimidating and opaque enough to be interesting. And the other stories, the ones that circulated at certain dinner parties and certain penthouses, spoken quietly near the end of the evening when the wine had done its work. Those stories described a man who controlled the Eastern Seaboard's organized crime infrastructure with an efficiency and ruthlessness that had eliminated 4 rival organizations in 7 years. She knew all of it. She also knew, standing in the rain in her ruined wedding dress, that she had approximately 60 seconds to make the worst or best decision of her life. "Why are you here?" she said. "I was in the area." "Don't insult my intelligence." "Not tonight." Something shifted in his expression, almost imperceptibly. The faint compression of his mouth that she would later recognize as the closest he came to being impressed. "All right," he said. "I'll tell you why in the car." "That's not an answer." "No," he agreed. "It's a choice. You can stand here and let this city watch you fall apart in your wedding dress. Or you can get in the car and hear a proposition that I think will interest you." She looked at him. The rain drummed against the umbrella over their heads. Somewhere above them, through the cathedral's stone walls, she could hear the distant sound of voices. The party apparently continuing, or perhaps converting into something else. A different kind of event, the kind that fed on wreckage. She thought about Grant's voice at the altar, the precision of his cruelty, the way he had curated her humiliation down to the camera angles. She said, "If you touch me without my permission, I will find a way to make your life considerably more difficult than it already is." Dorian Vale looked at her for a long moment. "Noted," he said. She picked up the hem of her dress with both hands, descended the 2 steps, and got into the car. Out. The interior of the SUV was warm and dark and smelled faintly of leather and something cold, winter air and expensive cedar. Vivienne settled into the seat and became immediately aware of the absurdity of her situation, which she catalogued and set aside. The absurdity of her situation was the least of her concerns. She had spent the last 2 hours discovering the man she loved was a carefully constructed fiction. Absurdity was a minor upgrade. Dorian Vale got in beside her. The door closed. The convoy moved. He did not speak immediately. Neither did she. The silence wasn't uncomfortable so much as it was deliberate. 2 people in proximity, both deciding how much to reveal and in what order. She looked out the rain-streaked window. Manhattan scrolled past, indifferent and luminous. She had grown up in this city, had always believed she understood it. Now it looked like a stage set someone had failed to properly secure, all surface and no substance. "The Sovereign Circle," Dorian said finally. She turned from the window. "They've been building a coalition for approximately 14 months, he said. 6 separate crime organizations, 3 financial interests, 2 city council members who are considerably more entrepreneurial than their constituents understand. Their collective position is that my empire is vulnerable. Is it? Every empire is vulnerable to something. He said it without apparent concern, the way a person states a law of physics. Their specific argument is that I have no stabilizing personal architecture, no family, no heir, no public relationships that would make my removal costly in terms of public sympathy. She understood where this was going. The destination had been visible from the second sentence, but she let him arrive at it himself because she wanted to observe how he framed it. "You need a wife," she said. "I need a partner who can stand beside me publicly in a way that restructures the perception. Someone whose presence signals stability and permanence without being a liability. And you came to a cathedral steps to find her on the night of her failed wedding. I came to make you an offer that you're in a position to evaluate honestly tonight in a way you wouldn't have been yesterday." That was accurate. She hated that it was accurate. "What are the terms?" she said. He turned to look at her then. In the moving light and shadow of the car, his face was difficult to read, carved into planes of calm that she suspected had taken years to engineer. "You'll have complete financial independence through a joint account structure I'll establish in your name. You'll maintain your own work, the foundation, whatever you choose to pursue professionally. You'll live in my residence, attend the necessary public events, and conduct yourself publicly as my wife. And privately? Privately, you'll have your own wing, your own staff, your complete autonomy. I have no interest in controlling your personal life, your movements, or your time." "How long?" "Until the sovereign circle is neutralized. 14 months, perhaps 18, after which we file for a quiet, amicable separation, and you walk away with your finances secured, your reputation rebuilt, and your name no longer associated with whatever Holloway's career becomes." She was quiet for a moment. "And what do I not know yet?" she said. "What's the part you haven't told me that you'll eventually need to tell me?" He looked at her, that same considering look from the cathedral steps. "That's a sophisticated question," he said. "I just spent a year not asking sophisticated questions. I'd like to correct that pattern." He was quiet for a moment. "There are elements of this arrangement that carry risk. My enemies are competent. Being publicly associated with me places you in their field of consideration. How much risk? Meaningful, not extreme. Your security detail will be comprehensive. I'll want full disclosure on the threat assessment. Agreed. I'll want my own attorney to review whatever contract you draft. Preferred." She looked at her hands in her lap. Her engagement ring, 3 carats, cushion cut, Grant had chosen it with input from a stylist, caught the passing lights and scattered small cold rainbows across the car's interior. She was still wearing it. She hadn't noticed until now. She should have left it at the cathedral. She should have dropped it on the altar and walked out without it, but she'd been so focused on not crying that she'd forgotten the ring entirely. She worked it off her finger without ceremony and held it for a moment, this small piece of compressed light that had once meant everything and now meant nothing at all. And then she opened the center console between them and placed it inside. Dorian watched this without comment. "I'll need 24 hours, she said. "You'll have it." "Where are we going right now?" "The Meridian. You'll have a suite for the night. No obligation, no surveillance. If you decide this isn't something you want, the car takes you wherever you want to go in the morning." She looked out the window again. The city was wet and blazing and vast and full of people who had watched her humiliation ripple out across their social media feeds for the past 2 hours. And who would wake up tomorrow and discuss it over coffee with the mild enthusiasm people bring to other people's disasters? She was 29 years old. She had done everything she was supposed to do. The right school, the right network, the right relationship, the right timeline. She had built her life according to a blueprint handed to her by people who were themselves living out blueprints given to them by other people, and the whole architecture had just collapsed in front of 500 witnesses in a cathedral off Fifth Avenue. She was also, she noticed, not crying. "All right," she said. 24 hours. Quote. The Meridian Hotel occupied the top 6 floors of a tower on West 57th Street, and Vivienne's suite was on the 54th floor with floor-to-ceiling windows that looked south over the park. At this hour, the park was a dark rectangle of shadow bordered by strings of light, and beyond it the Midtown skyline rose in its characteristic nighttime configuration, theatrical, improbable, magnificent in its indifference to individual human suffering. She stood at the window for a long time in the dark, still in her wedding dress because she had nothing else. A bag arrived within the hour. Clothing, toiletries, A note from no one explaining nothing. She unpacked it with the methodical efficiency she defaulted to when her emotional circuitry was operating on emergency protocols. Someone had guessed her size correctly. The clothing was simple: dark trousers, a gray cashmere sweater, a change of underclothes. Thoughtful without being presumptuous. She filed this away. She called her mother at 11:30. The call lasted 4 minutes. Her mother spent 3 of those minutes describing the social fallout with the efficiency of a war correspondent, and 1 minute asking if Vivienne was all right, in the tone of someone who considers emotional stability to be a performance discipline rather than an actual state. Vivienne said she was fine and meant neither yes nor no, but rather, "I am operational and not requiring intervention," which was the closest to fine she could truthfully claim. She did not mention Dorian Vale. She did not call anyone else. She sat on the edge of the bed in the borrowed sweater and looked at her own hands. Bare now, the ring finger slightly paler than the rest, a small physical record of the things she'd taken off. And she thought about Grant Holloway for the last time she intended to think about him that night. Grant was not a monster. This was, she understood, the most dangerous thing about him. Monsters were legible. You could see them coming, could understand their mechanics, could build your defenses accordingly. Grant was something more ordinary and therefore more destructive. He was a man who had looked at the woman he was supposed to love and found her insufficient, and rather than have the private conversation that decency required, had chosen the version of the ending that served his public narrative best. He had needed the spectacle, the public confession, the before and after of Celeste Monroe standing where Vivienne was supposed to stand, signaling his transformation from conventional to dynamic, from old money to new ambition. She had been a prop in someone else's campaign launch. She had not understood this because she had not been paying attention, and she had not been paying attention because she had been busy believing in things. She would not make that mistake again. She called Dorian's number at 7 in the morning. He answered on the second ring. "Yes," she said. That was it. That was the whole call. A pause. "I'll have the documentation ready this afternoon. My attorney's name is Rachel Crane. Her office is on Park Avenue. She'll need at least 72 hours to review whatever you send." "I'll allow 96. Then we're in agreement." She hung up and stood at the window with coffee she'd made badly, using the room's small machine, and she watched the park beginning to emerge from its darkness as the morning came gray and wet through the skyline. And she thought, for the first time, about what she was actually agreeing to, not the contract, not the legal architecture of it. She had retained Rachel Crane specifically because Rachel Crane was ferocious and careful and had spent 20 years protecting people who had made complicated decisions under pressure. She thought about the man himself. Dorian Vale was 41 years old, according to the profile the Times had run during his acquisition of the Harlow building. He had grown up in Queens. This was public record, a detail his PR operation had apparently decided played better as authentic blue-collar origin story than as something to be obscured. His father had worked in construction. His mother had left when he was 9. He had built his first real estate holding before he was 25, and his second before he was 27, and from there the public record became a matter of carefully managed press releases and audited financial statements. The private record was what mattered. The sovereign circles, she knew, because you did not grow up in certain New York social circles without accumulating certain knowledge by osmosis, was not an abstraction. It was a genuine coalition of organized interests that operated at the intersection of crime and capital and municipal power, and it had been building toward direct confrontation with Vale's organization for longer than 14 months, in her estimation. The signals had been there for anyone who knew what they were looking at, and Grant, she now understood, had known exactly what he was looking at. This thought arrived cold and precise, like a blade finding the precise line between one thing and another. Grant, whose collapsing campaign had needed new financing and new allies. Grant, whose connection to Celeste Monroe went back considerably further than the year he'd claimed at the altar. She was nearly certain of this, could feel its shape in the negative space of 100 small memories. Grant, who had been appearing at the same fundraising events as 2 of the city's more prominent real estate investors in the past 18 months. Investors whose portfolio overlaps with Vale Capital were a matter of documented public record. She had not connected these things until this moment. She stood very still with her bad coffee and the gray morning coming through the glass, and she let the shape of it assemble itself in her mind. Grant hadn't simply fallen in love with someone else. Grant had moved. He had chosen a side in a war and positioned himself accordingly, and the public humiliation of Vivienne Ashcroft at the altar of Blackthorn Hall was not a side effect of his choices, but a deliberate statement. I am clean, I am moving forward, I am no longer associated with that world. Her world. She set the coffee cup down on the windowsill harder than she intended. Rachel Crane reviewed the documentation in 78 hours and called Vivienne on a Tuesday morning with the tone of a person who has found both problems and solutions and is prepared to discuss them in order. It's clean, Rachel said, which is more than I expected. What's the catch? There isn't one, structurally. The financial provisions are actually generous. He's offering the joint account structure plus a separate discretionary account in your name with a 7-figure floor. The security provisions are comprehensive, the confidentiality clauses are mutual and fair, and the exit conditions are clearly defined. A pause. This is not a contract written by someone trying to trap you. What's it written by? Another pause, shorter. Someone who's done this before. The precision is professional. There's no language that leaves you exposed, and no language that leaves him exposed either. It reads like a business partnership because that's what it actually is. Vivienne said, "Is there anything you want me to push back on?" The timeline flexibility clause. I want a defined hard ceiling on the arrangement length rather than the until objectives are achieved language. I'll propose 24 months maximum. I also want stronger language on your personal security approval. Right now it reads as though his team has unilateral authority over your protective detail, and I'd prefer you have co-approval on personnel. He'll likely agree to both. That's what concerns me, honestly. Vivienne understood this. A counterpart who accepted every modification was either very eager or very confident. The modifications didn't matter. She signed the contract on a Wednesday afternoon in a conference room on the 47th floor of a Vail Capitol building, with Rachel Crane on one side and Dorian Vail's attorney, a precise, quiet man named Ferris, who communicated entirely in careful monosyllables, on the other. Dorian himself was not present. He sent a text at 4:15 that said, "Welcome to an interesting arrangement." She stared at it for a moment and then wrote back, "Let's make it count. Bosh." His residence was a penthouse in the West Village that occupied the top 2 floors of a converted industrial building, and nothing about it resembled what she had expected. She had prepared herself for the aesthetic of calculated power, dark marble, statement art, the kind of interior design that announces its own significance. What she found instead was a space that looked lived in, genuinely, in ways that suggested its occupant had preferences rather than just resources. Books everywhere. Not decoratively arranged, but actually read, spines cracked, some of them face down on surfaces in the manner of someone who'd been interrupted mid-chapter. A long work table in the main living space covered in documents and 3 different laptops, none of them closed. The kitchen showed evidence of actual use. The walls carried art that was interesting rather than impressive. She stood in the entry with 2 bags, she had not accumulated much, and took inventory. Dorian came in from the terrace. He was in dark jeans and a white shirt with the sleeves pushed up, and the absence of the suit was a minor reconfiguration of her mental image of him. He looked less armored this way. Not less dangerous, she noted, just less armored. "Your wing is through there," he said, gesturing down a hallway to the left. "Completely separate entrance if you want it. There's a key-coded door that gives you direct elevator access without coming through the main space." "I won't need that." He looked at her. "Most people need it eventually." "I'm not most people." He made a sound that wasn't quite a laugh, something between acknowledgement and skepticism, and moved toward the kitchen. "Have you eaten?" "On the way." "Then I'll give you the security briefing." He settled at the work table and pulled a folder toward him. "The primary threat assessment right now grades at a moderate high. 2 of the Sovereign Circle's eastern units have been surveilling this building since late September. My team has identified the approach angles they're working with, and we've responded accordingly, but you should understand what you're in proximity to." "Show me the assessment." He looked up. "The actual document," she said. "Not a summary." He was quiet for a moment. Then he slid the folder across the table. She sat down across from him and opened it. For the next 40 minutes, they worked through the threat assessment in the manner of 2 people reading a shared text in a law library. Heads down, intermittent questions, no performance of emotion about the material. He answered her questions without condescension, which she appreciated more than she would have said aloud. She asked 3 questions he found necessary to look up, which she appreciated for different reasons. Outside, the West Village evening began doing its particular autumn thing, cooling rapidly toward blue, street sounds clarifying as foot traffic thinned. She could hear the city from the terrace doors he'd left open. The clean percussion of it, horns and voices, and the low mechanical hum that never quite stopped. "You're not what I expected," she said. It wasn't a compliment or a criticism, just an observation. He looked up from the document he was marking. "What did you expect?" "More theater. I save that for people who need to be managed." "And I don't?" He held her gaze. "You're not someone who responds well to being managed. That was clear in the first 30 seconds. She thought about that. "What happened to your sister?" she said. The stillness that came over his face was of a different quality than his usual composure. It wasn't a wall going up. The wall was already there, had always been there. This was something behind the wall, something that moved against it briefly, and then went quiet. "That's not part of our agreement," he said. "No," she said. "It's not." She closed the folder and pushed it back across the table. He watched her do it. "The public event calendar for next month," she said. "I'd like to review it tonight so I understand what I'm walking into." Something shifted in his expression. Not warmth exactly, but too early for that, too guarded on both sides. But something that acknowledged the implicit contract beneath the explicit one. "I'll push. You'll hold. And eventually we'll figure out where the real lines are." "I'll pull it up," he said. "What?" The weeks that followed were a negotiation conducted entirely in behavior. Vivienne worked mornings at her foundation. She ran a grant-making organization focused on housing access for low-income families, a project she had built from a 4-person operation into something that now distributed $11 million annually, and returned to the penthouse in the late afternoons to find, invariably, that Dorian was already there. He worked from home with the regularity of someone who had structured his life to avoid unnecessary movement. The building's security made this practical. They ate dinner together 3 or 4 times a week. Not by design. It simply happened, the way things happen when 2 people occupy the same space and both are hungry at the same hour. The conversations were careful at first. Professional. They discussed the upcoming public appearances, the strategic logic behind each one, the specific message each event was intended to communicate to specific audiences. Then, gradually, they discussed other things. She learned that he read widely and sloppily, starting 5 books at a time, finishing 2 of them, abandoning the rest with no apparent guilt. She learned that he had a genuine, specific interest in urban planning that predated his real estate career and informed it in ways that were intellectually honest rather than just financially convenient. She learned that he hated formal dinners, not the food, but the particular social performance of them, the way important people use the format to conduct status negotiations disguised as conversation. He learned, she suspected, things about her in return, though he articulated them less directly. He learned that she was better at silence than most people he encountered, and that her silences were specific, different configurations for thinking, for watching, for deciding. He learned that she did not perform distress, but could sit with it cleanly, the way someone sits with weather. "This is what's happening. I'll move through it." He learned that Grant Holloway had called her twice in the first week. She had not answered. The second week, Grant sent flowers. She donated them to a hospital lobby on 8th Avenue. The third week, she attended her first public event on Dorian's arm, a benefit for a children's hospital foundation at the Winthrop Gallery in Chelsea. And the moment they walked in together, she felt the room recalibrate. Not dramatically, not with the operatic gasps of bad movies. It was subtler than that. A collective adjustment of attention, the way a room full of people will instinctively reorganize their awareness around the entrance of a significant gravitational force. She wore navy. He wore black. They had not coordinated this, and it looked like they had. He kept his hand at the small of her back, and she allowed this without comment, understanding its tactical necessity. When they were introduced to the city's deputy mayor, Dorian deferred to her in the telling of a story about her foundation's latest initiative with a naturalness that she recognized as practiced, but that was executed well enough to feel genuine. She told the story. The deputy mayor was impressed. In the car home, she said, "You've done this before. Attended charity events? Used a woman strategically in a room full of people." He was quiet for a moment. "I'm not using you, Sec," he said. "That's not what I—" I know what you meant. He looked out his window. I've had partners who understood the arrangement. It's not the same as using someone. She considered this distinction. It held up, she decided, under moderate scrutiny. How many people in that room know what we are? She said. No? 3. Suspect? 50. The rest believe it because they want to. People believe the marriages they're shown. She looked at her own window, the West Village approaching. Grant was there tonight, she said. 3rd room, near the bar. He arrived about 40 minutes after we did. Dorian was quiet. He watched us for most of the evening, she said. You knew he was there. Yes. You didn't tell me. I didn't want to change how you moved. She thought about this. It could have been control, the management of information as management of behavior. But she considered the actual outcome and found that his calculation had been correct. Knowing Grant was in the room would have altered her carriage, her expression, her performance. She would have been performing to Grant rather than to the room. Next time, tell me in advance, she said. I can hold 2 things at once. He turned to look at her. Noted, he said. It was the same word he'd used on the cathedral steps. She wondered if he remembered that. 5 weeks into the arrangement, she found Dorian on the terrace at 2 a.m. She had woken up unable to sleep. This happened sometimes, had happened more frequently since the wedding, and had gone to the kitchen for water, and the terrace doors were open to the November air, and he was out there in a heavy jacket with a glass of something clear, sitting untouched on the railing. She hesitated in the doorway. He heard her anyway. Can't sleep? He said without turning. No. You? I don't sleep much. She got her water, and then, on an impulse she didn't examine, she went out to the terrace. The city was doing its late-night thing, quieter, but not actually quiet. The hum lower-pitched and steadier than the daytime noise, a collective exhalation of millions of lives continuing in the dark. The cold air was clean and sharp. She could see the Hudson from this angle, a dark mirror between the buildings, and beyond it the New Jersey lights scattered in irregular constellations. She stood beside him at the railing. They were quiet for a while. Her name was Serafina, he said. She did not look at him. She looked at the river. She was 23, he said. She was the only person who ever told me when I was wrong without being afraid of what I'd do about it. A pause. They were aiming at me. The car they hit was supposed to be mine. She borrowed it to drive to a friend's apartment because her own car was in for service, and I told her she could use it. Vivienne kept her eyes on the water. I'm sorry, she said. Not as a performance, as a fact. It was 8 years ago, he said, as though time was supposed to have done more with it. Time doesn't really do what people say it does, she said. He looked at her then. In the darkness and the city glow, she couldn't read his expression precisely, but she felt the quality of his attention shift. No, he said. It doesn't. They stood there for a while longer, 2 people in the cold, with the city spread below them like proof of something. Maybe that enormous things could persist in the dark, could keep running on their own momentum even when the people inside them were falling apart. She went back inside first. She slept eventually. She was almost at the door to her wing when she heard him say quietly, to no one or to her, She would have liked you. She did not turn around. She carried it with her to sleep instead, and she lay in the dark with it. And somewhere around 3:30 in the morning, she understood, with the particular clarity that only arrives at that hour, that she was in serious danger of caring about this man. Not yet. Not fully. But the door was open, and she hadn't closed it, and she wasn't sure she wanted to. The morning came gray and cold and ordinary. Downstairs, her phone showed 3 missed calls from a number she didn't recognize. When she ran it through a search, it came back registered to a shell company with no traceable ownership. She showed it to Dorian at breakfast. His expression did not change, but something behind his eyes went very still, the way water goes still when it's deepest. Forward those to Marcos, he said. Marcos was his head of security. And don't go anywhere alone today. Why? We'll talk tonight. He looked at her directly. The timeline just changed. She felt something cold settle in her chest that had nothing to do with the November air coming through the kitchen window. She forwarded the calls, but the day passed without incident, and then the evening came, and Dorian was 2 hours late returning from a meeting downtown. And when he finally came through the door, He had a cut above his left eyebrow that was carefully cleaned but clearly recent, and his jacket was missing, and he walked to the kitchen and poured 2 glasses of water with the methodical precision of someone running on anger and adrenaline and very little else. She stood in the doorway and looked at him. "How bad?" she said. "They hit one of my distribution centers in Red Hook. 3 people were hurt. Nobody died." "And the cut?" "Glass." He turned to look at her. His eyes were not cold, she realized. They had never been cold. They were controlled. There was a difference, and it had taken her 5 weeks to see it. What was behind the control was not emptiness. It was the opposite of emptiness. A heat that had been compressed until it was almost unrecognizable as heat. "This is going to escalate," he said. "I know. You should consider leaving for a tour." "Don't," she said. He stopped. "Don't offer me an exit right now," she said. "I'm aware of the exits. I'm choosing not to take them. Tell me what we're doing next." He looked at her for a long time. She held it. And then, very quietly, with the careful deliberateness of a man who has spent years keeping accounts and paying them in full. "All right," he said. "Then let me tell you about the Sovereign Circle. All of it." She sat down at the work table. He sat across from her, and he talked for 2 hours. Not in the manner of a man confessing. No apology in it, no performance of vulnerability. He laid it out the way a surgeon lays out instruments, each piece in its correct position, each piece with a specific function, nothing included for effect. The Sovereign Circle had begun as a financial arrangement between 6 independent criminal organizations operating in overlapping eastern seaboard territories. Drugs, extortion, contract labor fraud, municipal contract manipulation. For years, they had maintained a kind of hostile equilibrium, competing, occasionally violent, but fundamentally too fractured to constitute a unified threat to any single power structure. 3 years ago, that changed. The architect of the change was a man named Carver Whitfield, 62 years old. Publicly, a retired investment banker with a philanthropic foundation and a seat on 2 hospital boards. Privately, the operational mind who had spent 36 months quietly acquiring controlling interests in 4 of the 6 circle organizations through a combination of debt financing and targeted pressure. 2 of their former leadership figures had died in circumstances that were ruled accidental and were not. Whitfield's thesis was simple. A consolidated criminal enterprise with legitimate financial infrastructure and municipal political access was effectively invulnerable to law enforcement intervention. He was largely correct about this. The Circle had survived 3 federal investigations in the past 18 months, not through operational security, but through ownership of the investigation's oversight chain. What Whitfield wanted, specifically, was Vail Capital's real estate portfolio, particularly the 15-building cluster in Lower Manhattan that controlled approach access to 3 port infrastructure nodes. The logistics value alone was enormous. The political leverage was larger. "He's been trying to buy it for 2 years, Dorian said. Through intermediaries, through pressure on my financing relationships, through regulatory harassment. None of it worked. So now he's moving to direct action." The Red Hook hit tonight was a message, not a serious operational strike. They were sloppy, they left witnesses, they weren't trying to be invisible. They wanted me to feel them. "And the calls to my phone this morning?" He was quiet for a moment. "That was a different message. That was about you specifically." She held his gaze. "They know about the arrangement. They knew within 48 hours of the courthouse filing. I expected that. And you didn't tell me they'd make contact. I expected them to probe through financial channels first. The phone calls were faster than I anticipated." He looked at her directly. "That's a failure of my assessment, and I'm telling you so." She noted this, not the admission itself, but the absence of hedging around it. He had been wrong about the timeline, and he said so plainly, without the elaborate qualification that most men applied to being wrong. She filed it. "What do they want from me?" she said. "Information, initially. Your background is useful to them. You're embedded in a social network that overlaps significantly with mine, and you have access to my residence. If they can develop a relationship with you, even a surveillance relationship, they gain visibility into my operations. And if I won't cooperate with that," his jaw tightened slightly, "then you become leverage of a different kind." The word landed in the room and stayed there. Vivienne looked at the work table between them. The documents, the laptops, the cold coffee from 2 hours ago. The entirely mundane infrastructure of a very dangerous life. All right, she said. Then we need to talk about what I can actually do, not what you want to protect me from. What I can contribute operationally. He looked at her. I'm serious, she said. My social access is real. My network is real. If Whitfield is using municipal relationships, and I have existing connections to 3 city council members through my foundation work, that's not nothing. It's also not nothing to put you at risk by. Dorian. She said his name for the first time, she realized, with that particular weight. Not as address, but as attention demand. I didn't get in the car to be managed. If I'm in this, I'm in it. The silence that followed had a different texture than their previous silences. Heavier. More loaded with the weight of competing assessments. We'll talk about it more tomorrow, he said finally. Tonight I need to deal with Red Hook. She didn't push. She'd made the position clear. She went to bed at midnight with the particular alert stillness of someone who has just agreed to something large and hasn't yet felt its full dimensions. She felt them at 6:15 the next morning when her coffee was interrupted by Marcos arriving at the penthouse with dried blood still visible at his hairline and the expression of a man who had been awake for 30 hours and was running entirely on professional obligation. 3 more last night, he said to Dorian, who had apparently not slept at all. 2 in Brooklyn, 1 in Staten Island. They hit the legitimate operations. A restaurant supply company, a parking structure, a dry cleaning franchise. Low violence, high visibility. They're burning the perimeter. Vivienne stood in the kitchen doorway. Neither of them told her to leave. Whitfield is escalating the timeline, Dorian said. He was looking at a map on his largest laptop screen, the city rendered in digital detail with small red markers appearing at intervals. He looked focused. He also looked exhausted in a way that had nothing to do with one sleepless night. The exhaustion of someone who had been carrying a particular weight for so long that he'd forgotten what his spine felt like without it. He's moving before we're ready. We're closer to ready than he thinks, Marcos said. Not close enough. What do we need? Vivienne said. Both men looked at her. Specifically, she said, what's the gap? Dorian turned back to the screen. The Circle's municipal access runs through 2 city council members, Fentress and Alvarez. They're blocking a zoning variance I need for the lower Manhattan portfolio, which limits my operational flexibility on 2 of the port-adjacent properties. If the variance goes through, it eliminates Whitfield's primary leverage point on the real estate side. I know Alvarez, Vivienne said. Personally, we've worked together on 3 housing initiatives through the foundation. He came to our benefit last spring. Dorian turned to look at her. He's not corrupt by nature, she said. He's under pressure. There's a difference. She paused. Let me talk to him. Vivienne, not about this? Not directly. About the Foundation's next initiative. I have a genuine reason to meet with him, a grant proposal for affordable housing development in his district. During that conversation, I can take a reading on where the pressure is coming from and how hard it's being applied. Marcos was looking at Dorian. Dorian was looking at Vivienne. You understand what you're walking into, he said. It wasn't a question. I understand I'm walking into a conversation with a city council member about housing grants, she said evenly, which is what I do professionally. If the conversation goes further than that, I'll make a judgment call. A long pause. You report everything to Marcos within the hour of any meeting, Dorian said. You don't go alone. You don't deviate from the stated purpose of the meeting unless the opening is entirely clear and the risk is minimal. Agreed. And you tell me if anything feels wrong, before you act on it, not after. She met his eyes. Agreed. Marcos looked between them with the expression of a man watching 2 very different weather systems approach each other from opposite directions. The meeting with Alvarez happened 4 days later over lunch at a midtown restaurant he'd chosen, which told her something. A man under surveillance pressure or under instruction from someone monitoring his movements chose public observable locations. The restaurant was busy and well lit and had 3 exits, and Alvarez arrived 8 minutes late with the specific kind of controlled hurry that meant he'd been sitting in a car outside timing his entrance. He was 51, compact, well-dressed in the careful way of a politician who had grown up without money and had not forgotten it. He smiled when he saw her, and the smile was genuine. She had known him long enough to know his real expressions from his performed ones, but there was something behind it, a tightness at the jaw. They talked about the grant proposal for 20 minutes. The initiative was real, a 20-unit affordable housing development on 2 lots in his district that she'd been planning to fund for 6 months. He was engaged, asked the right questions, offered 2 specific contacts in the city's housing office who could accelerate the permitting process. Then he said, with the deliberateness of someone who had been waiting to say it, "How are you doing, Vivienne? Really?" She looked at him. "I ask," he said, "because your name has come up in some conversations recently that surprised me." "What conversations?" He picked up his water glass and put it down without drinking from it. "I've been receiving some pressure on a zoning matter, from parties I'd rather not be receiving pressure from. And your name, specifically your new domestic situation, has been mentioned in the context of that pressure." She kept her expression neutral. "In what context?" "In the context of someone wanting me to understand that my cooperation on the zoning matter would be observed and appreciated by people who are watching your situation closely." He met her eyes. "I don't like being used as a messenger, Vivienne. I'm telling you directly because you deserve to know someone's using your name as currency." She held his gaze. "Who delivered this message?" "A mutual acquaintance. Someone whose name I'd rather not say in a restaurant." "Was it direct pressure or implied? The kind that doesn't leave fingerprints?" He leaned forward slightly. "I've known you for 4 years. You've done real work, good work. I don't know what's happened in your personal life, and I'm not asking, but whatever it is, be careful." She nodded once. "Thank you, Marcus. I mean that." She got back in the car and called Marcos before they'd turned the first corner. Dorian's reaction that evening was not what she expected. She had expected cold efficiency, the strategic assessment, the recalibration of the approach. What she got instead, when she walked through the door and found him already knowing from Marcus's preliminary report, was something that moved across his face and was gone in less than 2 seconds, but that she caught, a flare of something raw and immediate that had nothing to do with strategy. "They're using you as a pressure mechanism," he said. Flat, controlled. "I know." Alvarez confirmed it. Whitfield moved faster than Dorian. She set her bag down. "I'm not hurt. I wasn't approached directly. I got useful information. This was the right call. I shouldn't have agreed to it." "You didn't make that decision?" "I did." He turned away from the window and looked at her with an expression that she had not seen on his face before. Not anger, not cold assessment. Something that sat uneasily in the space between protectiveness and frustration, like a man who has spent years controlling every variable in his environment and has suddenly encountered one that doesn't respond to control. "You are not—" He stopped. "Say it," she said. "You're not a piece on the board," he said. "And I keep having to remind myself of that because every instinct I have wants to move you to a safer position, and that's—" A pause. "That's not what this is. That's not what you are." The room was quiet. She looked at him carefully, at the set of his jaw, at the way his hands were very still at his sides, the particular stillness of a man exercising conscious restraint. She had spent 5 weeks learning to read him, and she knew that stillness meant the opposite of stillness. It meant everything that wasn't being expressed was pressing very hard against its container. "Then stop thinking of the board," she said. "Think of the next move." Something in him settled, not fully, but enough. "The Alvarez information tells us Whitfield has penetrated our social perimeter further than we mapped," he said, "which means there are other contact points we haven't identified. Start with anyone who's been in a room with both of us in the last 6 weeks. Cross-reference against known circle adjacents." "Marcos is already running it." She nodded. She was moving to the kitchen, her coat still on, when he said, "Vivienne." She turned. He looked at her for a moment. The city behind him through the terrace doors, the late November darkness full of the city's perpetual light. "Thank you," he said. It came out like something he'd had to locate carefully, a word in a language he hadn't spoken in a long time. She held it for a moment. "Don't thank me," she said. "When?" The charity gala at Hargrove Hall was 3 days later. It was on the calendar. It served a strategic purpose. Visibility, alliance signaling to 3 of Dorian's legitimate financial partners who would be present, and canceling it would communicate weakness to the people watching for weakness. They went. She wore black. He wore black. This time they had coordinated. The room was everything these rooms were. Beautiful and transactional, and filled with people performing versions of themselves for audiences of other people performing versions of themselves. She moved through it beside Dorian with the settled efficiency she'd developed over the past weeks, reading the subtext of each interaction, noting who made eye contact with him and who very deliberately didn't. She was in conversation with a Foundation Board member near the East Bar when she saw him, Grant Holloway. He was across the room and he was looking directly at her, and the expression on his face was something she hadn't seen before. Not the confident cruelty of the altar, not the calculated performance of political charisma. Something undone. Something that had been stripped of its architecture and was revealing, under the ruin, a person who looked genuinely frightened. She looked away. She finished her conversation. She found Dorian at the room's center and touched his arm once. Their agreed signal for "I need to tell you something." And he extracted them both from the cluster of finance executives with the practiced ease of a man who has been extracting himself from rooms his entire life. "Grant's here," she said quietly. Dorian's face did not change. "I know. He arrived 11 minutes ago. You were going to tell me." "In approximately 2 minutes, yes." She made a sound that communicated her position on this clearly enough that he didn't press it. "He looks bad," she said. "His campaign financing collapsed last week. 2 major sponsors withdrew. The Celeste Monroe story is still running." Dorian glanced across the room with the efficiency of someone taking a threat assessment. "He's been trying to reach you." "I know." "He's also been making contact with Whitfield's people." She went very still. "Since when?" "Since before the wedding." She processed this. The shape of it. The shape she had felt forming in the hotel room that first morning. The negative space of 100 small memories, clarified into something definite and hard-edged. "He's been feeding them information," she said, "about your operations. About me. About you specifically, yes. Your schedule, your social calendar, your foundation's contact network. He's been providing it in exchange for—" "Don't." She said it quietly and Dorian stopped. She stood very still in the beautiful room full of beautiful people doing their beautiful negotiations, and she let the full dimensions of it arrive without flinching. Grant had not simply fallen in love with someone else. Grant had chosen a side in a war against the man she was now standing beside, and he had used his access to her, every dinner, every event, every private conversation she'd had in proximity to him over the past year, as raw material for that choice. He had mined their relationship the way you mine a resource. Extract what's valuable, leave the rest, and don't think about the hole you've made. She felt something move through her that was not grief and was not anger exactly. It was colder than anger. It was the specific temperature of someone who has just understood that they will not be surprised again. "All right," she said. Her voice came out level. "Then we handle it." She turned toward Grant's side of the room and Dorian's hand caught her arm. Not hard, not aggressive, but certain. She looked at him. "Not here," he said. "Not tonight." She looked at him for a moment. "He doesn't know we know," Dorian said. "That's worth more right now than confrontation." She held the tension in her chest and made a deliberate choice about what to do with it. Dorian was right. She knew he was right. She also hated that he was right, which was a different calculation and not one that belonged here. She turned back toward the center of the room. Then Grant was there. He had crossed the floor while she was looking at Dorian, and suddenly he was 3 feet away, and the expression on his face had shifted into something that was trying very hard to be the old confidence and succeeding only in demonstrating how far the old confidence had receded. "Vivienne," he said. She looked at him. "You look—" He stopped, recalibrated. "I've been trying to reach you." "I know. We need to talk. There are things—" He glanced at Dorian. Something moved across his face at that glance, something between contempt and fear that resolved into contempt because contempt was easier to inhabit. "Things I need to say to you privately." "No," she said. He blinked. "Vivienne, we don't have anything private to discuss, Grant. We don't have anything to discuss at all." The color moved into his face. She watched it happen with a clinical detachment that surprised her. The flush of injured pride in a man who had not expected to be refused, who had arrived at this conversation preloaded with the assumption that her presence at this event indicated residual availability, residual need, residual her in relation to him. I made a mistake, he said. Lower now, tighter. You made many. Vivienne, He took a step toward her. His hand came up. Dorian moved, not dramatically, not with the theatrical displacement of a man performing dominance. He simply shifted his position so that he was between Grant's hand and Vivienne's arm, a single lateral step that repositioned the geometry of the situation entirely. Grant looked at him. Dorian looked back. The two men stood in this configuration for approximately 4 seconds. And in those 4 seconds, an enormous amount of information was exchanged without a word being spoken. The specific information being, I know what you are, I know what you've done, and I am waiting for the correct moment to address it, and you should think very carefully about whether this is that moment. Grant stepped back. His jaw was working. His eyes moved to Vivienne. This isn't over, he said. It was meant to sound like a warning. It landed like a statement of damage assessment, the declaration of a man who has realized he is losing but hasn't accepted it yet, which is the most dangerous kind. She said nothing. Grant turned and walked back across the room. Dorian didn't watch him go. He turned back to Vivienne, and his expression was composed and careful, and she could feel, in the air between them, the compressed weight of everything he wasn't saying. The anger that had nowhere to go, the specific fury of a man whose entire world has just been reminded of how it can be used against him. Are you all right? He said. Yes. I'm sorry you had to. Don't apologize for him. Don't give him that much weight. He was quiet. They stayed at the event for another 40 minutes because leaving would send the wrong message, and they were both people who understood that in this particular war, every message counted. She drank 1 glass of wine she didn't want. He drank nothing. They moved through the room with the careful synchronization of 2 people who had, without discussing it, developed the kind of peripheral awareness of each other's position that usually takes years to build. In the car on the way home, neither of them spoke for a long time. Then he said, I should have told you about Grant earlier, about the full extent of his involvement. She turned to look at him. I knew for 11 days, he said. I was building the documentation first. I didn't want to tell you until I had all of it. She thought about this. She thought about the specific weight of someone deciding what she was ready to know and when she was ready to know it. She thought about a year of dinners with a man who was feeding information about her to her current husband's enemies. And she thought about the 11 days during which the man sitting beside her had known this and said nothing. Don't do that again, she said. I know. Dorian! She waited until he looked at her. I need you to understand this clearly. If you're protecting me from information, you're making me less safe, not more. His jaw was tight. Yes. Is there anything else I don't know? He was quiet for a moment that lasted long enough to answer the question before he spoke. The call this morning from the Circle's Eastern Unit, he said. It wasn't a probe. It was a deadline. Whitfield gave me 72 hours to begin divesting the Lower Manhattan portfolio. The deadline is tomorrow night. She stared at him. And you weren't going to tell me tonight because tonight I wanted one event where you weren't carrying it. The car was stopped at a light. The city glowed around them. She looked at his profile, at the hard line of his jaw, at the exact quality of exhaustion in the set of his shoulders, at the face of a man who had been carrying so much for so long that the carrying had become structural, had become the actual architecture of who he was. She understood the impulse. She even understood the care underneath it. She also knew with absolute certainty that care administered as concealment was its own kind of damage. Tomorrow, she said, we deal with Whitfield. Yes. Together. A pause. The light changed. The car moved. Yes, he said again, and this time the 72-hour deadline expired at 11:14 the following evening, and Dorian did not divest a single property. What he did instead was spend the daylight hours of that final day executing a series of moves that he and Vivienne had mapped together across the kitchen work table until 3 a.m. Legal filings, financial repositioning, a carefully timed press statement about Vail Capital's new community development initiative in Lower Manhattan that made any forced divestiture politically toxic for the city officials Whitfield had in his pocket. It was clean work, precise, the kind of play that used the opponent's leverage against itself. By 6 in the evening, Marcos had confirmed that 2 of Whitfield's council-adjacent contacts had gone quiet on the zoning obstruction. By 8, Dorian's attorney had filed the variance application through an alternative channel that bypassed the blocked committee entirely. By 10, Vivienne was cautiously reading the silence as something close to progress. By 11:14, Whitfield's response arrived. It did not come through financial channels. It did not come through regulatory harassment or municipal pressure or any of the mechanisms they had mapped and prepared for. It came through Dorian's phone, a single call from a number his system flagged as originating inside one of his own buildings. And when he answered it, the voice on the other end belonged to a man named Trent Calloway, Dorian's head of Eastern operations, who had worked for him for 9 years and who was, at the moment of the call, standing inside the Red Hook distribution facility with 4 of Whitfield's men and a complete copy of Vail Capital's internal logistics infrastructure on a portable drive. Dorian listened for 45 seconds. His face did not change. He said, "I'll call you back," and hung up. He stood very still for a moment in the center of the kitchen. Vivienne watched him. "Calloway, sit," he said. That was all. She understood immediately from the way he said the name. Not with anger, not yet, but with the specific flat quality of a man absorbing a blow that has arrived from a direction he had categorically excluded from his threat assessment. "How long?" she said. "I don't know yet." He set the phone on the counter with careful precision, the kind of careful that meant the alternative was throwing it. He has the operations architecture, warehouse locations, transit routes, the financial layering on 4 of the legitimate fronts. Does he have the port properties documentation? If he has the operations architecture, he has everything that connects to it. She processed this quickly. The port properties were the center of gravity of Whitfield's entire play. What he wanted, what he'd been maneuvering toward for 2 years. With the internal documentation, he didn't need the zoning variance to fail or the council pressure to work. He had the map. He could go around every obstacle they'd just spent the last 18 hours constructing. How did Calloway get access to the portable drive? He built the architecture. Dorian's voice was quiet. He's been inside the operations infrastructure since the beginning. There's no level of it he couldn't access. He's been with you 9 years. Yes. The word landed like a stone in still water. She watched the ripple of it move across his face. Not the surface face, the controlled one, but something underneath that, something she'd only seen once before, on the terrace at 2 in the morning when he'd talked about Serafina. He trusted very few people. She was beginning to understand how few. "Marcos," she said. He was already moving. Marcos arrived in 14 minutes, which meant he'd been close, which meant some part of the security apparatus had been running a parallel track on Calloway that Dorian hadn't fully briefed her on, which she noted and set aside for later. There were larger things to address. The 3 of them stood in the main living space with the city spread below the terrace doors, and Marcos laid it out in the flat, consecutive manner of a man delivering a damage report in a field hospital. Calloway had made his first confirmed contact with Whitfield's organization 7 weeks ago. The surveillance log showed 3 in-person meetings, 2 encrypted data transfers, and 1 cash transaction that had cleared through a shell structure registered in Delaware 7 weeks ago. Vivienne ran the timeline. 7 weeks ago was 3 days before she had moved into the penthouse, before her name had entered the equation at all. "He was already turned before I arrived," she said. "Yes," Marcos said. She looked at Dorian. His jaw was working very slightly, the only outward sign of what was happening behind the composure. He was standing near the window with his arms at his sides, and his face forward, and he looked, she thought, like a man standing on the deck of a ship that has already taken on the water that will sink it. Who knows this and is still calculating whether there's a way to make the math work differently? "The press statement we filed tonight," she said. "The Community Development Initiative." Marcos looked at her. "Calloway would have known about it before we filed it," she said. "He would have briefed Whitfield on our counter-move while we were still making it." The silence that followed was a specific kind of silence, the silence of 3 people arriving simultaneously at the same bad conclusion. They had not outmaneuvered Whitfield tonight. They had moved exactly as Whitfield had predicted they would move along a path that Calloway had mapped for him in advance, and the press statement and the variance filing and the 18 hours of careful strategy had been, from Whitfield's perspective, entirely visible, expected, allowed. He let us think we were winning, Dorian said, quiet, precise. Because the play was never the zoning variance. The play was the drive, Vivienne said. He needed time to get the full documentation. The pressure on the variance was the distraction. It kept us focused on the municipal angle while Calloway completed the transfer. Vivienne turned away from both of them and walked to the window. The city below was doing its indifferent midnight thing, blazing and enormous, and entirely unconcerned with the specific shape of their situation. She stood there for a moment and breathed deliberately, the way she had learned to breathe when the ground was moving, deep and even, in through the nose, forcing the chest to slow. Then she turned back. The drive contains the operations architecture, she said. It does not contain the ownership structure of the port properties themselves. Those are held through a separate legal entity that's not connected to Vale Capital on paper. Dorian looked at her. I read the full documentation package when Rachel reviewed the contract, she said. The port properties are held through an independent trust that predates Vale Capital by 3 years. Calloway built the operations architecture. He wouldn't have had access to the trust structure unless someone in your legal team was also compromised. A pause. Dorian looked at Marcos. Marcos was already on his phone. If the trust documents are clean, Vivienne said, Whitfield has the map, but not the deed. He knows how the operations run, but he can't prove ownership of the properties he wants. That limits what he can do with the drive legally. He doesn't need to do anything legally, Dorian said. He needs to show it to the 3 federal contacts he has in the Organized Crime Task Force and let them build the case. How long does that take? 6 weeks minimum. Probably 10. Then we have a window. He was watching her with an expression she recognized now. Not the assessing look from the cathedral steps. Something past that. Something that had developed over 7 weeks of dinners and late nights and shared threat assessments. It was the look of a man recalibrating not his tactics, but something more fundamental. The window is narrow, he said. Then we work fast. Marcos came back in from the hallway. Legal team is clean. The trust documents are isolated on a separate server that Calloway didn't have access to. She's right. He has the operations picture, but not the ownership chain. Dorian exhaled once, very controlled. The exhale of a man releasing exactly as much pressure as the moment required and retaining the rest. Pull Calloway in, he said to Marcos. Tonight, quietly. Marcos left. Dorian turned back to the window. He stood there for a long moment with his back to her, and she gave him the moment because some moments require their full duration before a person can inhabit what comes after them. Then he said, I brought Calloway up. When he was 24, he was running low-level collections in Red Hook, and I saw something in him and I pulled him out of it, and I built him into someone who could run Eastern operations. A pause. I was wrong about him. You were right about him for 9 years, she said. That's not how it feels. No, she said, but it's what's true. He turned around. His face had the quality she associated with a man who had arrived at the bottom of something and was standing there steadily, which was different from a man who hadn't reached the bottom yet. There was a clarity to it that was almost painful to look at directly. We need to move on Whitfield before he gets the drive authenticated and in front of the federal contacts, he said. I have a meeting arranged for Friday with 2 of the Circle's independent members, men who were folded into Whitfield's coalition under financial duress, not by choice. If I can offer them a cleaner alternative, they come out of the Circle and Whitfield loses 2 of his 6 operational units. What's the cleaner alternative? Debt restructuring through Vale Capital. I absorb what Whitfield owns on their operations at favorable terms, they get clean, and I get the organizational intelligence on how deep the Circle's federal penetration actually runs. She thought about it. Whitfield will know about the Friday meeting. Yes, through Calloway's existing access. So Whitfield will move before Friday. Dorian nodded once. Which is why the meeting location is a construction site in Brooklyn that I've used twice before, and that Calloway knows well. You're setting up the meeting as a trap. I'm offering Whitfield an opportunity to overcommit, he said. If he moves on the meeting location, he exposes 3 or 4 of his operational tier, the people he's been careful to keep off our surveillance map. She looked at him carefully. And the 2 Circle members you're supposedly meeting with, are they real? A pause. One of them is, he said. Who's the other? There is no other. The second name on the meeting manifest is a false identity I've been building for 4 months in case I needed a controlled exposure scenario. She was quiet for a moment. You've been planning this for 4 months, she said. The scenario architecture, yes. Not the specific execution. That's been shaped by what we've learned in the last 3 weeks. She thought about everything that had happened in the last 3 weeks. The threat assessment, the Alvarez meeting, the gala, Calloway. She thought about the 11 days he'd known about Grant before telling her, and the 72-hour deadline he'd held back for a night, and the parallel surveillance track on Calloway that Marcos had clearly been running without her knowledge. She thought about standing in this apartment for 7 weeks believing they were building something together. How much of this, she said carefully, have you been deciding without me? He met her eyes. The operational architecture predates you, he said. The execution has been collaborative. That's a legal answer. A pause. Yes. She felt it then, the specific cold clarity of a pattern revealing itself. Not cruelty. Nothing so legible as cruelty. Something more structurally embedded. A man who had operated alone for so long, who had made every calculation independently for so long, that collaboration had become something he performed at the surface while the actual decision-making continued in the same interior space it had always occupied. She had thought she was inside the room. She had been in the anteroom. The Friday meeting, she said. What's my role in your plan? You attend a foundation event on the same evening. Public, visible, well-documented. It gives us a clean separation between my operational activity and Pamus and keeps me out of the way. His jaw tightened. And keeps you safe. Dorian. She said it quietly, and she kept her voice even, because she was not going to have this conversation at elevated volume. That was not who she was, and it was not what this moment required. I need you to hear what I'm about to say without defending yourself until I've finished. He was still. You told me I wasn't a piece on the board, she said. You said it and I believed you because I had evidence for it. The Alvarez meeting, the way you listened, the way you argued with me about the threat assessment instead of just overriding me. I had real evidence and I used it to construct a picture of what we were building. She paused. But you've been running a parallel operation for 4 months that you designed entirely alone, and that positions me at a foundation event on the night you expose Whitfield's people so that I am clean and separated and protected and completely uninvolved in the actual outcome. He started to speak. I'm not finished, she said. He stopped. I understand the instinct, she said. I understand it better than you probably think I do. You've been protecting people your entire adult life, and the last person you tried to protect died in a car that was meant for you, and that is a weight I can't fully imagine, and I'm not dismissing it. She held his gaze. But if you make my decisions for me in the name of protecting me, you're not treating me as a partner. You're treating me as something to be preserved. And I am not a thing to be preserved, Dorian. I am a person in this with you. And if that is not actually what this is, I need to know that right now. The room was very quiet. Outside, the city continued its indifferent running. He looked at her for a long moment, a look that had the quality of something being examined honestly, without the mediation of strategy or self-protection, the way a person looks at something they've been carrying in a closed hand and finally opens the hand to see what it actually is. You're right, he said. She waited. The Friday plan keeps you separated because I don't trust myself to make good operational decisions if you're at risk in proximity to me. He said it plainly, without hedge. That's the truth of it. That's not strategic. That's a personal failure of... His phone went off. Not the regular ring. The emergency channel. A sound she'd only heard once before. The night of the Red Hook strike. A specific double tone that Marcos used only when the situation had moved beyond planning into active emergency. Dorian picked it up. She watched his face. She had learned to read his face over 7 weeks, and she read it now. The initial assessment, the reorientation, the specific compression of his expression that meant the calculation had just changed in a fundamental way. Not worse than expected. Something else. Something that didn't have a category yet. He lowered the phone. Grant took Marcos's secondary vehicle off a street in Chelsea 40 minutes ago, he said. He had 4 men. He has the location of the Friday meeting site. She stared at him. How does Grant have Calloway? His voice was absolutely flat. Grant has been in contact with Calloway for 6 weeks. Calloway fed him the Friday sight as a secondary insurance policy. If the drive wasn't enough to destabilize us, Grant was a variable Whitfield could deploy. She stood very still and felt the full architecture of it arrive all at once. Grant had not been a peripheral irritant. Grant had not been a desperate ex-lover making bad decisions from wounded pride. Grant had been an active instrument in Whitfield's operation for 6 weeks, fed information by Calloway, managed and directed, pointed at Dorian's operation like a weapon at a target. And the specific information he now had, the Friday meeting site, meant that Whitfield knew the trap was a trap and was preparing a counter. The 2 circle members, she said, the real one and the false identity. If Grant gives Whitfield the site and Whitfield sends an armed response, the one real circle member walks into it, she said. Yes. And if that man is killed or captured at a meeting that was supposedly a legitimate negotiation, every other independent circle member reads it as me executing defectors. His voice was controlled, and under the control was something that was very close to the edge of not being controlled. Every potential defection closes, every alternative pathway to breaking the circle without full-scale conflict disappears. She understood it completely. It wasn't just a setback. It was a structural demolition of the only nonviolent path through this. If the Friday meeting went wrong, the only remaining option was war. Direct, extended, expensive in every sense of the word. Whitfield had not just matched their move, he had found the single pressure point that could unravel everything was standing in a warehouse in Red Hook, with 4 armed men and a phone full of information he didn't fully understand, and Dorian was already moving toward the door before Vivienne said his name. Stop. He stopped. She was across the room in 4 steps, her hand on his arm, not restraining him but requiring him to be present for the next 30 seconds before he moved into whatever was coming next. Listen to me, she said. If you go to Red Hook right now without a plan, you're walking into exactly what Whitfield wants. Grant is not the objective. He is the distraction. Dorian's jaw was set so hard she could see the muscle working beneath the skin. His eyes had that quality she'd seen once before and had not forgotten. The compressed heat of a man whose control was operational rather than instinctive, held in place by will rather than by the absence of what was underneath it. Marcos is already down, he said. 2 of his men are with him. Situation unclear. If I don't move, if Marcos is down and Grant is in Red Hook, who is watching this building right now? A beat. A single beat of silence in which she watched him arrive at the same place she was already standing. Calloway knew the penthouse layout, she said. He knew the security rotation. He built the Eastern Operations architecture, which includes every safe house, every secondary location, every fallback position you have in this city. She held his gaze. Red Hook is where they want you to go. The phone in his hand went off again. This time, it was a number she didn't recognize, and when Dorian looked at the screen, something moved across his face that she couldn't read in its entirety. Part recognition, part something colder. He answered it on speaker. You're smarter than Calloway gave you credit for. The voice was measured, older, with the particular unhurried quality of a man who had spent decades being the most dangerous person in every room he entered and had long since stopped needing to demonstrate it. But then, Calloway underestimated most people. Dorian said nothing. Your security chief is alive, the voice said. Inconvenienced, but alive. I'm not interested in bodies tonight. Bodies create paperwork, and paperwork creates federal attention, and I've had quite enough of that this year. Whitfield, Dorian said. I've been trying to have a simple business conversation with you for 2 years, Whitfield said. You've made that very difficult. Say what you want to say. I want the Lower Manhattan portfolio, the 4 port-adjacent properties specifically. I'm prepared to pay market rate plus 15%, which is a generous premium for assets whose operational value to you has now been significantly compromised by Mr. Calloway's cooperation with my team. No. A pause. Not a surprise pause. An expected one. The pause of a man who had predicted this answer and prepared the response. Your new wife is at this moment attending what she believes is a foundation board meeting at the Whitmore Center on West 43rd Street, Whitfield said. She's been there for approximately 20 minutes. The board meeting was genuine. I checked. However, the individual who requested her presence at this specific meeting, this specific evening, was acting on my behalf. The temperature in the room dropped. Vivienne felt it happen in her own chest. A cold, precise contraction. like a fist closing around something vital. Dorian's voice came out completely flat. If you touch her, I don't want to touch her. I want you to understand the geometry of your situation. Another measured pause. You have approximately 40 minutes before the board meeting concludes, and she walks out onto West 43rd Street alone. I have people there. I have people at every secondary location Callaway mapped for me. I have the operations documentation, and I have the federal contacts to make it actionable within 72 hours. A sound that might have been, in a different man, a sigh. Or, you sign a letter of intent on the portfolio tonight. I call off the people on 43rd Street. We execute a clean transaction, and you rebuild whatever you want to rebuild with whatever remains of your organization. The call ended. Dorian stood absolutely still for 4 seconds. Then he was moving, not toward the door but toward the work table, pulling up 3 screens simultaneously, typing with the focused speed of someone running parallel calculations in real time. Vivienne was already on her phone. She called the foundation's executive director, a woman named Petra, who ran board meetings with the organizational precision of someone who had once managed a logistics firm, and asked her to confirm tonight's attendee list. Petra confirmed it in 90 seconds. The individual who had requested Vivienne's presence at tonight's meeting was a foundation donor named Edward Sills, who had made a significant contribution 18 months ago and had been requesting a meeting ever since. She pulled Sills' donation record on her foundation tablet. 18 months ago. She ran the name through the corporate registry search Dorian kept on the secondary laptop. Edward Sills appeared as a registered agent for 3 shell companies. One of them shared a Delaware registration address with the shell structure Marcos had identified in Callaway's cash transaction record. He's been inside my foundation, she said. Dorian looked up. The donor who called the meeting. He's connected to Whitfield's financial structure. He's been there for 18 months. She felt the cold in her chest intensify. Before you and I. Before any of this. He got into my foundation when I was still with Grant. The shape of it assembled itself completely in that moment. Whitfield hadn't pivoted to using Vivienne as leverage when she'd married Dorian. Whitfield had been building access to her network for a year and a half, through Grant's proximity, through the donor pipeline, through the patient, architectural patience of a man who played a very long game. She was not collateral in this war. She had been a target of an entirely separate operation that had been running in parallel. He doesn't need me on West 43rd Street, she said. He already has what he needed from my foundation network. The board meeting tonight is theater. It's to establish that he can reach me whenever he wants. Yes, Dorian said. He was looking at her directly, which means the threat is real, but the timeline is manufactured. He wants me moving on emotion, not on calculation. Can we get to Marcos? His last confirmed position was Red Hook. 2 of my men are en route, but they're 12 minutes out. The one real Circle member, the man you were going to meet Friday. Where is he now? Dorian pulled up a contact. Safe house in Astoria. Call him, she said. Right now. Not to warn him about Friday. Tell him Whitfield just moved against you directly, and you need a meeting tonight. If he comes, he was never Whitfield's, and you have an ally. If he runs, or if he stalls, he was compromised, and you cut him. Dorian looked at her for a moment with the particular quality of attention she had come to associate with him, recalibrating something at a fundamental level. Then he dialed. The man, she would later know his name as Reyes, though tonight he was still an abstraction to her, answered on the 3rd ring. The conversation lasted 4 minutes. She could hear only Dorian's side, terse, specific, without preamble. When it ended, Dorian set the phone down. He's coming, he said. He knew about the Callaway breach 3 days ago and didn't tell Whitfield. Then you have one piece that's still clean. 1 piece and 40 minutes. She looked at him. He looked back. Between them was the work table with its maps and documents, and the cold coffee and the 2 laptops, and 7 weeks of something that had begun as arrangement and had become, without either of them formally acknowledging it, the central operational and personal fact of both their lives. Tell me the fastest way to end this tonight, she said. The plan they built in the next 22 minutes was not elegant. It was the kind of plan you built when the elegant options were gone. Functional, high risk, dependent on several things going right in sequence and on one crucial variable that neither of them could fully control. They left the penthouse in a single unmarked vehicle with two of Dorian's most trusted remaining security team in the front. Not the armored convoy of their public life. Something deliberate and low profile, moving through the city's late-night geography with the particular efficiency of people who no longer had the luxury of indirect routes. Vivienne sat beside Dorian in the back and did not speak for the first 6 minutes because there was nothing yet to say that would improve what was already in motion. She was aware of his shoulder against hers, the warmth of it, the solidity, the specific physical reality of a person she had spent 7 weeks learning in the particular way you learn someone when you are paying close attention under pressure. She was also aware that the next 2 hours contained a number of outcomes, not all of which returned everyone to this car. She did not look at him. She looked at the city scrolling past. Then she said, "Whatever happens tonight, I need you to know that I understood what I was in when I agreed to it." He was quiet. "I'm not saying that to give you permission to take risks with my safety," she said. "I'm saying it because if something goes wrong, I don't want the last thing between us to be me waiting for an apology." He turned to look at her, and his face in the moving light was very unguarded, more unguarded than she had seen it in daylight. The composed exterior reduced to something more fundamental and more true. "Nothing is going to go wrong," he said. "You don't know that." "No," he said, "but I'm going to proceed as though I do, because the alternative doesn't help either of us right now." She held his gaze for a moment. "All right," she said. He reached across and took her hand. Not with the considered deliberateness of their public performances, the strategic touch at the small of her back, the managed proximity for cameras and witnesses. This was different. This was someone reaching for something because the distance had become intolerable. And the hand that took hers was not the hand of Dorian Vale, billionaire developer, tactical operator, most feared man on the eastern seaboard. It was the hand of a man who was tired and furious and badly frightened and was choosing, in the middle of all of that, to hold on. She let him. Red Hook at midnight was wet asphalt and sodium light, and the smell of the harbor coming in heavy off the water. The distribution facility, a converted warehouse on a street of converted warehouses, indistinguishable from its neighbors unless you knew what you were looking at, showed two lights in the ground floor windows that Dorian's man in the front seat confirmed as Marcos's signal: occupied, stable, waiting. They went in through the loading bay. Marcos was in a back office with a cut across his left forearm that had been field-dressed with the focused competence of a man who had done this before, and the expression of someone operating 3 levels past exhaustion on professional obligation alone. 2 of Grant's men had been secured, zip-tied to support columns with the calm efficiency of Dorian's security team, who had arrived 9 minutes before them. 2 others had fled. Grant himself was not there. "He left 20 minutes ago," Marcos said, "before my team arrived. He took 1 man in a vehicle and he had Calloway on the phone when he went." Dorian's face did not change. "Where's Calloway?" "We lost the track. He went dark 4 hours ago." Marcos met Dorian's eyes directly. "I should have seen it sooner. The contact pattern was there and I missed it. We'll talk about that later." "Dorian." "Later, Marcos." Not cruel, final. The way you close a door that has to stay closed until there's time to open it properly. Vivienne was moving through the office, taking inventory, maps on the table, a laptop showing an active feed from a location she didn't immediately recognize. Waterfront, industrial, different from Red Hook. She looked at it for a moment. "Marcos," she said, "what location is this feed from?" Marcos came to her side. He looked at the screen and went very still. "That's the Kellner facility," he said. "Pier 47. "Is that one of ours?" It was. He looked at Dorian. "Calloway transferred operational control of Kellner 6 weeks ago. It's been running as a Circle facility since then." Dorian was beside her now, looking at the feed. The waterfront structure on the screen was large, partially lit, with the specific architectural character of a working warehouse adapted for other uses. There were figures moving in the frame, at least 6 that she could count, probably more outside the camera's angle. "Whitfield's people are staging from Kellner tonight," Dorian said. It wasn't a question. "It's the logical consolidation point. It's waterfront access, secured perimeter, Circle controlled since Calloway's transfer." Marcos pulled up a second screen showing a map overlay. If they're moving on the portfolio properties tonight, using tonight's chaos as cover for something more direct, they'd stage from Kellner, Dorian said. Vivienne looked at the map. The Kellner facility sat at the intersection of 3 approach routes to the port-adjacent properties Whitfield wanted. From there, with sufficient force and the documentation Calloway had provided, a coordinated physical occupation of the properties was not just possible. It was straightforward. He's not waiting for the federal contacts, she said. He never was. The documentation and the federal angle were pressure mechanisms, ways to keep you reactive and defensive while he positioned for direct action. She traced the map with her finger. He's taking the properties tonight, physically. Fait accompli. Once he has physical control, the legal and financial architecture he builds around it becomes his problem to solve on his timeline, not yours. The room was quiet. Outside, the harbor moved against the pilings in its slow, indifferent rhythm. Dorian looked at the map. She could see him working through it, not with the compressed fury of a man reacting, but with the cold precision of a man who has finally seen the complete shape of the thing he's been fighting and is choosing how to meet it. Reyes, he said to Marcos, how far out? 11 minutes. And our available people right now. Clean, confirmed, not touched by Calloway's access. 8 men, including the 2 in the front of your vehicle. Possibly 4 more if I can reach the secondary team in Brooklyn, but they're 20 minutes minimum. 8 people against what Whitfield has staged at Kellner, Vivienne said. It's not a military operation, Dorian said. We're not fighting our way in. We're getting there first. He looked at Marcos. If we are inside the Kellner facility with documentation, specifically the trust documents that Calloway didn't have access to, when Whitfield's people arrive to execute their acquisition, the physical situation reverses. They're not occupying an asset. They're invading a facility where the legitimate owner is present with the legal documentation to prove it. That only works if the legal documentation is sufficient to make Whitfield's people hesitate, Vivienne said. It only needs to make them hesitate long enough for the authorities to respond, Dorian said. I have a federal contact, not Whitfield's contact, a different one, cleaner, who has been building a case on the Circle's municipal penetration for 14 months. I've been feeding him material for 8 of those months. He looked at her steadily. If I call him right now and tell him that Carver Whitfield is staging an armed occupation of port-adjacent property tonight at Pier 47, he will move. She looked at him. You have an active federal cooperation relationship. I have an information-sharing arrangement that doesn't require me to expose my own operations. How long have you? 18 months. She absorbed this. Another parallel track. Another piece of the architecture she hadn't been inside. But this one she could not fault him for, could not frame as concealment rather than compartmentalization, because the logic of it was sound. An active federal relationship was exactly the kind of information that compromised operationally if it spread beyond one person. Call him, she said. He was already dialing. The drive to Pier 47 took 9 minutes. Reyes met them at the outer perimeter, a compact, dark-eyed man in his mid-40s who looked at Dorian with the specific expression of someone who has chosen a side and is aware of what the choice costs and has made it anyway. He had 2 men with him. The night was cold and wet, and the harbor smell was everywhere. Inside the Kellner facility, the lights were on in the main loading bay. Grant Holloway was standing in the center of it. He was alone. The man who had driven him here was somewhere in the peripheral darkness, and there were 2 figures visible at the far end of the bay who were not Dorian's people and who were very still in the way of people waiting for a signal. But Grant himself was alone in the central light, and the expression on his face when Dorian walked through the loading bay door was not the expression of someone who had planned this. He looked like a man who had walked into something much larger than he understood and had only just realized it. "Grant," Vivienne said. He turned to her. His eyes moved from her to Dorian and back, and in the movement she saw the full architecture of the last year, all of it compressed into a single look. The self-deception and the calculation and the fear, and under all of it, pathetically, irreducibly, the particular wounded pride of a man who had made a catastrophic choice and was only now understanding its full dimensions. "I didn't—" He stopped. "This wasn't what I agreed to." "What did you agree to?" she said. "Whitfield said it was business, pressure. He said nobody was going to get hurt. He just needed... Stop. Dorian's voice was absolutely quiet. You gave Whitfield access to this facility. You gave Calloway the cover he needed to run his operation. You used information you gathered from a woman you were supposed to love, and you handed it to the people who killed my sister. He took one step forward. And you're going to stand there and tell me you didn't know. Grant's jaw worked. I didn't know about... Her name was Serafina. Dorian's voice did not rise. It descended into a register so low and controlled it was more frightening than anything louder would have been. She was 23 years old. She died in a car that was meant for me, that was targeted by people who are now standing in my building preparing to take what I've spent 15 years building. He stopped. Close now. 4 feet between them, no more. Did you know? The silence stretched. Grant looked at Vivienne. She gave him nothing. Not rescue, not condemnation, nothing. Whatever he said next, he said on his own. I knew they'd been involved in a conflict with you years ago, he said. I didn't know the specific. You didn't want to know. A pause. The harbor against the pilings. The distant sound of trucks on the highway above. No, Grant said. It came out quiet, almost stripped. I didn't want to know. Vivienne looked at him and felt the last of something leave her, not with the dramatic finality of the altar, not with the cold fury of the gala, just a quiet subtraction, the last residue of the person she had been when she believed in him, departing without ceremony. Outside, 4 vehicles were approaching the facility. Not Whitfield's people. Their lights were wrong, their formation was wrong, and the radio in Marcos's hand was alive with a voice she recognized as purposeful and federal and exactly what Dorian had promised. But behind those vehicles, further back, moving from the waterfront side. They're coming in from the water, Reyes said sharply. Dorian was already moving. His hand found Vivienne's arm. Not restraining, directional. And she went with him toward the facility's interior as the loading bay doors behind them began to open and the cold harbor air came flooding in, and the first of Whitfield's people stepped into the light. There were more of them than 8, considerably more. And at the center of the group, moving with the unhurried deliberateness she had heard in his voice on the phone, was a man in a dark overcoat who looked exactly like what he was. A man who had been building toward this specific moment for 2 years and had arrived at it with the patience of someone who had never once doubted the outcome. Carver Whitfield looked across the loading bay at Dorian Vale. He looked, briefly, at Vivienne. Then he looked past both of them at the federal vehicles pulling into the outer perimeter, and something moved across his face. Not fear, not surprise, but the careful recalculation of a very intelligent man who has just encountered a variable he didn't account for. Mr. Vale, he said. His voice was exactly as it had been on the phone, measured, patient. You've been busy. So have you, Dorian said. The federal presence is a complication, Whitfield said. Not a resolution. You understand that? I understand that you're standing in a facility I own, with documentation to prove it, in front of federal agents who have 14 months of material on your organization's municipal penetration. Dorian's voice was steady. I understand that your exit options have narrowed considerably in the last 6 minutes. Whitfield looked at him for a long moment. Then very quietly he said, Where's Holloway? And the question landed wrong. Too specific, too sharp, without the measured patience of everything else he'd said. And Vivienne understood in that instant that Grant was not Whitfield's instrument. Grant was Whitfield's exposure. Grant knew enough, had been present in enough conversations, had been used in enough ways that his testimony, if it came to that, was the one thread that could unravel the entire municipal penetration case that Whitfield had spent years building insulation against. Whitfield didn't want the properties tonight. He wanted Grant. She turned. Grant was 6 feet behind her, and one of Whitfield's men was already moving toward him from the right side of the bay, and Dorian was already between them before she had fully processed the geometry. And the sound that followed was not a gunshot, but something close enough that everyone in the room... The sound was a concussion grenade. One of Whitfield's men had pulled it from inside his jacket and rolled it across the concrete floor, and the detonation was not lethal, but it was total. A white-hot erasure of sound and equilibrium that dropped 3 people immediately and sent the rest stumbling. Vivienne hit the floor on instinct. Not panic, the body's older intelligence taking over. and the world became noise and white light and the taste of concrete dust and her own heartbeat hammering in her ears like something trying to break out. She was on her hands and knees. The floor was cold. Her vision was strobing. She heard Dorian before she saw him, not his voice, his movement, the specific sound of someone moving with deliberate force through a chaotic space. And then his hand was on her arm, pulling her upright, and she got her feet under her and they were moving. Behind them, the loading bay had fractured into competing geometries. Whitfield's people pushing forward from the waterfront entrance, Dorian's reduced team holding the interior perimeter, and at the far end of the bay, the federal vehicles were at the outer gate, and the agents were on foot now, moving fast. And all of it was happening simultaneously in the particular compressed non-logic of a situation that has exceeded the capacity of any single person to fully track. Dorian pulled her behind a stack of steel containers near the facility's interior wall. He had a cut above his ear from something. She didn't know what. And blood was moving down the side of his face in a dark line that he was ignoring with absolute completeness. "Are you hurt?" he said. "No, you're bleeding. I know." He looked past her shoulder, calculating. Reyes has 2 of Whitfield's people contained at the east entrance. Marcos is with the federal team at the gate. The problem is the waterfront side. Whitfield still has 5 or 6 people between us and the outside. "Where's Whitfield?" He looked at her. "Where is he?" she said again. "Northeast corner." He pulled back when the federal vehicles arrived. She looked at the layout in her mind, the loading bay, the container stacks, the northeast corner where the facility's secondary office space butted against the exterior wall. 1 door in, 1 door out, and beyond it, the waterfront and the water and the specific geography of someone who had planned his own exit before he walked through the entrance. "He's going to walk out the waterfront door," she said. "He's been here before. He knows this building." "Yes. And if he walks out that door, the federal case has 14 months of material, but nothing that puts him physically at this facility tonight. Without a witness account of his presence here, he disappears into the infrastructure he's built," she said, "and starts over." Dorian was looking at her with that look she knew now, the one that had moved from assessment to something more honest over 7 weeks, and was now something she didn't have a clean word for but recognized in her chest before she recognized it in her mind. "I'm going to the northeast corner," he said. "I know." "Stay with—" "No," she said. His jaw tightened. "You know my answer," she said. "Stop wasting time asking the question." A beat. 1 beat, in which he looked at her and she looked back, and the whole compressed weight of the last 7 weeks passed between them, in the specific shorthand of 2 people who have been paying close attention to each other under pressure and have, without planning it, become fluent in each other's most essential language. "Stay behind me," he said. "Within reason," she said. They moved. The northeast corner of the Kellner facility was separated from the main loading bay by a corridor of secondary storage, metal shelving, equipment crates, the accumulated infrastructure of a working warehouse. The overhead lights here were industrial and harsh, and threw hard shadows that moved when the building shook with the activity behind them. Whitfield was at the waterfront door. He was not alone. 1 man stood beside him, not a soldier, not the operational muscle that had come in from the waterfront, but a smaller figure in a good suit whose posture communicated legal function rather than physical threat. Someone Whitfield kept close for the moments when what was needed was not force but documentation. Whitfield heard them coming. He turned. In the industrial light, he looked older than his voice had suggested. The broad, settled authority of a man in his 60s who had spent 40 years building insulation between himself and consequence, and whose face now held the specific expression of someone performing the rapid calculation of which of several prepared exits was still viable. Dorian stopped 10 feet from him. The man beside Whitfield moved his hand toward his jacket. "Don't," Dorian said. "Quiet, absolute." The man went still. Whitfield looked at Dorian with the unhurried attention of someone who has been in difficult rooms before and has developed a practiced relationship with his own composure. "Mr. Vale, you've managed a more complicated evening than I anticipated." "Calloway," Dorian said. "Where is he?" "Mr. Calloway's usefulness concluded some time ago." A slight pause. "He's been moved to a position where he won't be a liability to either of us." Vivienne felt the implication land, not as shock, because she had understood what Calloway's value to Whitfield had become once the drive transfer was complete, but as a physical thing, a cold, specific weight in the center of her chest. Dorian's face was very still. He worked for me for 9 years. He worked for himself for 42 years, and for you for 9. The order matters. Whitfield glanced at Vivienne briefly, not with the assessing look she'd expected, something more oblique. Your wife is more perceptive than you gave her credit for. The Alvarez reading, the donor connection, those were clean pieces of analysis. You should have included her from the beginning. Thank you, Vivienne said. It came out flat and level, and Whitfield almost smiled. I don't want a war, Whitfield said. He returned his attention to Dorian. I've never wanted a war. Wars are expensive and imprecise. I want 4 properties and a functional arrangement that serves both our interests going forward. You just staged an armed occupation of a facility I own. A demonstration of reach, of what becomes necessary when legitimate negotiation fails. He tilted his head slightly. The federal team at your gate has 14 months of material. I have 2 contacts on the oversight chain who can redirect that investigation for another 14 months. We are, as of right now, exactly where we were 2 years ago. Both of us with significant resources. Both of us with significant exposure. A pause. Or, you give me the 4 properties. I give you Calloway's location, and we construct an arrangement that allows both operations to function without this kind of costly friction. Dorian said nothing. Vivienne looked at Whitfield and thought about the specific architecture of what he had just offered. Calloway's location as currency. Not delivered, not safe, not alive necessarily. Just located. She thought about the 9 years Dorian had built that relationship and what it had cost him tonight when it had broken, and she thought about a man named Carver Whitfield who had spent 40 years treating other people's losses as negotiating instruments. The federal agent at the gate, she said. His name is Harlan. He's been running the Circle investigation for 14 months on material that Dorian has been providing. She watched Whitfield's face. What he has isn't just financial documentation or operational records, it's recordings. 14 months of recorded communications between your organization and 2 city council members, 3 federal oversight contacts, and the 6 principals of your coalition. She paused. Including the communications that documented the targeting decision 8 years ago that resulted in the death of a 23-year-old woman on her way to a friend's apartment. Whitfield was very still. She held his gaze. Dorian didn't tell me the recordings existed until 40 minutes ago. He's been very careful about what he shared and when. She let a breath out slowly. But he told me tonight, because tonight it became relevant. And what those recordings contain is not 14 months of municipal corruption. It's direct evidence of a homicide. The man beside Whitfield was looking at his employer with an expression that had shifted from legal professional to something with considerably more personal concern in it. Whitfield's composure was intact. She gave him credit for that. The architecture of it was genuinely impressive, the product of decades of practice. But something had moved behind it. A tectonic adjustment that showed in the slight recalibration of his posture, the weight shifting forward and then back. A man finding his footing on ground that had just changed beneath him. You're speculating, he said. Call Harlan, Dorian said. Ask him what he has. A silence. Outside, the sounds of the waterfront, the harbor moving, the federal team's radios. A voice giving orders in the controlled, efficient cadence of professional law enforcement, managing a perimeter. Whitfield looked at Dorian for a long moment. Then he looked at Vivienne. And then, with the careful deliberateness of a man performing the last calculation he had available to him, he took his phone from his pocket and placed it on the nearest shelf. My attorney, he said to the man beside him, will be here within the hour. He sat down on a crate. It was not surrender exactly. It was the functional equivalent, a man who has run the exits and found them closed, making the single rational choice that remains, which is to stop moving and begin managing what comes next. Whitfield would have attorneys and structures and 14 years of insulation to work through before anything reached him legally. She understood this. Dorian understood it. But he was sitting down in a facility surrounded by federal agents with recordings that documented a homicide. Tonight, it was enough. The next 4 hours were institutional and exhausting in the way that Aftermath always was. The same questions asked in different configurations by different people in different rooms, the careful legal architecture of statements and documentation, and the specific procedural choreography of federal agents managing a scene that had more moving parts than any single person could fully supervise. Dorian and Vivienne were separated for questioning. She sat in a portable command unit at the facility's outer perimeter and answered Agent Harlan's questions with the methodical accuracy of someone who has decided that the only useful thing she can do right now is be precisely truthful about precisely what she knows and nothing else. Harlan was compact, mid-40s, with the particular quality of attention she associated with people who had trained themselves to listen harder than they spoke. He asked about the foundation donor. She gave him everything. The full records, the connection to Whitfield's shell structure, the timeline going back 18 months to before Grant Holloway, before any of this, to the point at which she understood that she had been someone's target before she had any idea there was a war. "How do you feel about that?" Harlan said. Not as investigation, as something else. She thought about it honestly. Like someone who didn't know they were standing in the middle of a road, she said, and is now standing on the curb, and is mostly just relieved to be on the curb. Harlan almost smiled. That's a reasonable way to feel. Grant was in a different unit, she understood, talking to different agents. What he said tonight would determine the specific shape of his legal situation, but the shape of his life, the career, the public identity, the carefully constructed image of a man moving upward, that shape had already determined its own resolution. You could survive political scandal. You couldn't survive being documented as a material contributor to an organized crime operation targeting federal witnesses, which was the specific category his assistants to Whitfield's people had placed him in. She thought about him sitting in that unit, and she felt nothing much. The absence of feeling was not numbness. It was completion. She had grieved what she needed to grieve in the first week after the wedding, and then had gotten into a car and started building something else, and whatever she had built was real and present and not contingent on anything Grant Holloway said in a federal interview unit on a pier in Red Hook. Calloway's location was confirmed at 2:17 in the morning. He was alive, injured, secured at a location in New Jersey that Whitfield's people had used as a holding facility for people who knew too much and needed to be positioned rather than eliminated. The federal team reached him within the hour. Dorian was told at 2:20. She was not present for this, but Marcos told her later that Dorian had received the information, said nothing, and then stood alone at the facility's exterior for several minutes before coming back inside. She understood what those minutes were. They did not return to the penthouse until nearly 4 in the morning. The city was doing its 4 a.m. thing. Not quiet, never actually quiet, but reduced to its essential frequency. The deep ambient hum of infrastructure and the occasional voice or engine cutting through it with the clarity that came from the absence of everything layered over it in the daylight hours. Dorian came in and sat down at the kitchen table and did not move for a long time. She made coffee badly with the small machine and put a cup in front of him and sat across from him, and they were quiet together in the way they had learned to be quiet, which was not empty but full of the specific content that two people accumulate when they have been paying close attention to each other through difficult things. His face in the kitchen light looked tired in a way that went deeper than the night's physical expenditure. The cut above his ear had been cleaned at the scene and was not serious but was still visible, a thin dark line at his temple. And his suit jacket was gone and his shirt was untucked, and he looked, she thought, like a man who had just put down something very heavy after carrying it for a very long time and was now adjusting to the new configuration of his own body. "Calloway?" she said. He looked at his coffee. "Yeah." "When did you know?" "I didn't. Not until tonight." A pause. "I suspected there was a breach somewhere in the Eastern operations for about 3 weeks. The pattern of Whitfield's moves was too well calibrated, not intelligence gathering accurate, which any competent operation can achieve, but response accurate. He was responding to decisions before they were implemented." He turned the coffee cup in his hands. "I ran the probability assessment on every person with sufficient access. I kept taking Calloway off the list. Because you trusted him. Because I built him." He said it flatly, without self-pity, which made it worse rather than better. "There's a difference. I knew I was biased. I ran the assessment anyway, and the bias won. She looked at him. You were right about one thing, she said. Earlier tonight, you said you make worse decisions when someone you care about is at risk in proximity to you. He looked up. That's not a flaw, she said. That's what caring actually costs. The people who don't have that problem are people who don't care about anything, and they make different kinds of mistakes. She held his gaze. You had a 9-year blind spot about Calloway because you cared about what you'd built with him. That's not the same as being wrong. It's the price of having been right for 9 years. He was quiet for a moment. I'm not going to forgive him, he said. I know, but I understand how it happened. A pause. Whitfield found the thing Calloway needed, and he gave it to him. That's what Whitfield does. He finds the gap between what people have and what they want, and he puts himself in that gap, and suddenly he's load-bearing. He looked at the table. I missed it because I had convinced myself I'd taken care of Calloway's needs. I hadn't. I'd taken care of the needs I could see. Vivienne thought about this. She thought about a year with Grant Holloway, about every evening she'd spent telling herself that the distance she felt was campaign stress, workload, the ordinary friction of two people in proximity. She thought about the specific, practiced blindness of choosing the interpretation that preserved the thing you thought you had over the interpretation that revealed what was actually there. We both spent a long time not asking the right questions, she said, about different people, for different reasons. He looked at her across the table. I'm asking them now, he said. It was not a declaration. It was not a romantic statement. It was the kind of sentence that a person who has been genuinely changed by difficult events delivers with the particular quietness of something arrived at rather than performed. She felt it land exactly where he intended it to land. So am I, she said. Whitfield was formally charged 6 weeks later. The municipal penetration case, built on 14 months of recordings and the testimony of 2 circle members who accepted the cooperation arrangement Dorian had offered, moved faster than anyone had publicly predicted. The 2 council members resigned within a week of the charges being filed. The federal oversight contacts were suspended pending investigation. Grant Holloway pled guilty to conspiracy charges in a proceeding that generated 3 days of press coverage and then sank beneath the news cycle's surface with the specific velocity of stories that confirm what people already suspected. His sentence involved 18 months of federal supervision, a substantial fine, and the permanent end of a political career that had consumed most of his adult life. Celeste Monroe's name appeared twice in the coverage and then disappeared. Nobody was surprised by anything. Calloway recovered from his injuries. He did not cooperate with the federal investigation, and he did not contact Dorian. Dorian did not attempt contact either. There were things that could be repaired and things that couldn't, and both men understood, without the conversation that would never happen between them, which category applied here. The port properties remained in the Vail Capital Trust. The zoning variance was approved in the ordinary course of municipal business once the 2 council members who had been blocking it resigned. The community development initiative Dorian had announced in the press statement, the one that had been initially a tactical move, he built anyway. 12 residential buildings, 3 commercial developments, and a public waterfront space in Lower Manhattan that opened 8 months later and had the specific functional quality of something built by someone who understood the difference between development and community. Vivienne attended the opening. She stood at the waterfront railing in the October sun and looked at the harbor and thought about a pier not far from here, where 7 months ago she had stood in the dark with the smell of concrete dust in her lungs and her heartbeat still too loud in her ears. She thought about the woman who had stood on the steps of Blackthorn Hall in a soaking wedding dress in the rain, watching her public life dissolve in front of 500 witnesses, and she tried to locate in herself the specific grief of that moment. It was there. It would probably always be there. Not large, not governing, but present the way scars were present, the way the body kept its honest record of what it had been through. She did not find this sad. She found it true. Dorian appeared at her left shoulder with 2 cups of coffee, both of them made well, because he had learned, as she had learned, as people learned when they were paying attention, what the other person actually needed versus what they asked for. He stood beside her at the railing, and they looked at the harbor together. "How's Petra taking the new Foundation donor disclosure protocol?" he said. He meant the reforms she'd implemented after the Sills connection was exposed. a full audit of the donor pipeline, and a new vetting process that Petra had initially approached with the polite resistance of someone who believed the existing system was adequate. "She's converted," Vivienne said. She called it robust 3 times in the last board meeting, which from Petra means she's in love with it. He made the sound that wasn't quite a laugh. "The Harlan case," she said. "The timeline on the homicide charge. 8 months to a year for the charge to be filed formally. The recording is clean, but the chain of evidence has to be established through 3 intermediary verifications." He paused. "It'll hold." And when it does, he was quiet for a moment. The harbor moved in its slow, indifferent rhythm against the new waterfront pilings. A boat was moving toward the mouth of the harbor, slow and purposeful against the light. "I don't know what it'll feel like," he said. "I've been moving toward it for 8 years. I don't know what the space looks like on the other side of it." She thought about this honestly. "I think it looks ordinary," she said. "I think that's the part nobody tells you. You spend years moving toward something, and when it resolves, the world doesn't look different. You just stop spending energy on that direction." He considered this. "And then you spend it somewhere else." "If you're paying attention," she said, "you already have." He looked at her. She looked back. The specific long conversation of a look between 2 people who have been through something real together and have chosen, with full knowledge of the cost, to remain in proximity to each other. Not because the cost has become manageable, because it has turned out to be worth it. "The contract," he said. "The exit provision." The 24-month hard ceiling Rachel had negotiated. They were at 7 months. 17 months remained on the clock. "What about it?" she said. "I'd like to renegotiate the terms." She turned to look at him fully. He was looking at the harbor, which was his particular way of saying something that required him to not be looked at directly while he said it. "Specifically," he said, "I'd like to remove the exit provision." She was quiet. "Not as a demand," he said. "Not as a unilateral decision, as a proposal, which you can decline, which changes nothing about the current arrangement except that I've said it and you know it." She looked at his profile, the hard line of his jaw, the cut at his temple now a faint pale line, the face of a man who had been armored for a very long time and was standing here in October sunlight at a waterfront he had built without the armor, saying something that had taken 7 months and a warehouse and a concussion grenade and a 2 a.m. terrace conversation and a dead sister's name spoken into the dark to arrive at. "Rachel will want the weekend to review the terms," she said. He turned to look at her. "She'll probably have notes," Vivienne said. "She always has notes." Something moved across his face that was not the compressed heat she'd learned to read in the early weeks, not the controlled stillness, not the careful performance of composure. Something simpler and more fundamental. Something that looked, in the October light with the harbor behind it, like a man who has just been told something he needed to hear and is feeling the full dimensions of it arrive. "Tell her she can have the whole week," he said. "I'll tell her Monday," Vivienne said. "I'd like the weekend." He understood this. He had spent 7 months learning to understand the specific vocabulary of her pauses and her silences and her qualifications, and this one he understood completely. Not reluctance, not condition, but the natural human need to sit with something good before making it official, to let it be real in the body before it became real on paper. "The weekend," he agreed. They stood at the railing with their coffee and the harbor light moving between them and around them. And the city continued its indifferent, magnificent operation behind them, and neither of them said anything else for a while because there was nothing else that needed to be said. The following Sunday was the kind of October Sunday that New York occasionally produces as if in apology for everything else, cold and clear and full of a particular quality of light that made the familiar look newly specific, each building and bridge and stretch of water distinct and vivid as if seen for the first time. Dorian went to the cemetery alone in the morning. This was his practice and had been for years, and she had no intention of changing it. Some things were not for sharing, not because they needed to be hidden, but because their meaning lived in their privacy. He came back at 11:30, and she was at the kitchen table with coffee and her laptop, reviewing the Foundation's Q4 grant slate, and he came in and put his jacket on the chair and sat down across from her. "I told her about you," he said. She looked up. "About the arrangement, the way it started." He looked at the table. "About the way it changed." He paused. I told her she would have liked you and she would have said something unbearably accurate about both of us within the first hour of meeting you, and I would have pretended to be irritated by it. Vivienne felt something move in her chest that had no clean name. Not grief, not joy, but the specific texture of something deeply true landing in a place that was ready to receive it. "What did she say?" she said, knowing this was impossible and saying it anyway. He looked up at her, and for the first time in 7 months, in all the conversations, and all the silences and all the hours of shared attention and difficult honesty, she saw him smile. Not the compressed acknowledgement she'd catalogued as his closest approximation. An actual smile, unmanaged, unstrategic, the face of a man who has found his way back to something he thought was gone for good. "She said I finally got something right," he said. Outside, the October light was everywhere, indiscriminate and clean, falling on the buildings and the water and the streets full of ordinary people conducting the ordinary business of their ordinary lives, which were not ordinary at all, which were in fact the whole of everything that mattered, and the city held all of it without judgment, as it always had and always would. Vivienne reached across the table. He took her hand. The story ended there, not with the resolution of every wound, because wounds did not resolve. They became part of the architecture of a person, the honest record of what they'd survived. Not with the elimination of risk, because risk was the permanent condition of being alive and paying attention to someone. Not with the transformation of either of them into something simpler than what they were. It ended with two people, imperfect and specific, at a kitchen table in the morning light holding on. And for the first time in a very long time, neither of them was afraid of what came next.